I'm Di Gillett, and this is the Power of Women podcast. We're a platform that showcases and celebrates the strength and resilience of women from all walks of life. In each episode, I pose questions to my guests that peel away the layers to reveal the knowledge and experience that shapes their narrative. So if you're feeling unseen, unheard, or simply looking for inspiration, then the Power of Women podcast is a fantastic place to join the conversation. Just before I start, are you following the podcast? The more followers, the more great content we can bring to you. Now for today's episode. Fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failing, and fear of not measuring up, and potentially fear of not belonging. Fear, listen carefully, can be paralyzing, debilitating, and limiting. Joining me to tackle this four-letter word is a trailblazer in rapid results coaching and hypnotherapy, with a 20-year track record in leadership in Silicon Valley and a dynamic presence in the international startup scene. Her approach is sharp and practical, combining her deep startup and corporate expertise with incisive business strategy, acumen, and intuition. Joining me on the Power of Women podcast is the perfect person to cut through your subconscious blocks and identify and face your fears. Julie Demsey. Julie, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here with you.
Fantastic. And I know you're injured. You've got one bandaged arm, which we may or may not see on screen. So thank you for joining. Julie, can I start with just a couple of grounding icebreaker questions, if I may? Where did you grow up?
Well, you might be able to tell by my accent. I grew up in the United States. By the time I was 11, we'd moved across four different states and settled in California. And that's where I spent the rest of my life till I moved here 7 years ago to Australia.
Wow, I can still hear that accent. So, in that, what's the most powerful learning you've taken away from your childhood?
Sure. I think the most powerful learning is one that I've only, maybe a decade ago really realized, which is even if we have a really great upbringing, we have things that stick in our subconscious mind that create stories and limiting beliefs that often hold us back. And as adults, we really need to examine those so that we can live to our full potential.
Yeah, that resonates. So, Julie, before we tackle the four-letter word starting with F, tell me, you were San Fran based for over 2 decades, working in the FMC, digital, and tech spaces. How did a woman fit into Silicon Valley 20 years ago?
Um, well, I had some great jobs and did some great things, so I was able to fit in, right? I
I
made it
can see
happen. I
that from
made
your
it
CV.
work.
Yeah.
However, I had to try harder and I had to prove myself over and over again, where the guy sitting next to me was automatically assumed that he knew what he was doing.
Mm. So tell me that what, if you break it down, what was so different then and how has it changed? Or in fact, has it changed?
So I've not spent time in the business community there for 8 years. However, over that 20-year period of time, and based on all the statistics now, it really hasn't changed. If you look at the
Mm.
number of females in leadership positions, if you look at the number of female founders getting funded, and statistics like that, things have not changed enough. And even we've still got a wage gap. So,
That's right.
while we are making it in and pushing our way in, it's not equal yet. There's
Mm.
a ways to go.
So if you reflect back 8 years ago and your time there, and it was a significant number of years spent, Julie, what were the most trying personal challenges at that time?
Yeah, I think the most trying personal challenges were really not being seen and heard. I could literally sit in a meeting and say something, and the guy next to me, nobody would say anything, and the guy next to me would repeat it and get accolades. So, there's a real visibility issue. And this would happen in meetings with people who specifically hired me for my expertise and who were male and who just didn't see it or
Isn't
pay it.
that incredible? I mean, well, incredible. Isn't that bloody shocking?
It
It's,
is.
yeah. So how did you overcome that? How did you get your voice heard in a room like that?
You know, I don't know that you overcompensate. So I worked harder, I worked longer, I burned myself out. I actually at one point had a HR business person come into a staff meeting and say, is this really happening? I started questioning myself and saying, am I just thinking I'm saying these things? And they came in and said, absolutely. And there's been a lot of books and studies since then that says this happens regularly to women
Yeah.
in the workplace. So
So taking that experience, how's that shaped you?
it's really made me um, have to work hard not to be bitter about it, right? And to see the positive side of it and to be able to say, you know what, there's a better way to be able to do this. And we've got to look for how can we make sure that we're heard? How can we make sure that we're seen? Really learning to back yourself. And I think I was a really strong manager back then because I did all of
Mm,
these things for the people on my team. And I think now, as a coach and hypnotherapist, I'm able to excel because I experienced all of this and I really know how to help my clients who are primarily female to
yeah.
show up and be seen and heard and help them build the confidence. And that's what it's all about. It's shifting that mindset
Mm.
and being able to say, I'm going to come into work and I'm going to back myself no matter what.
So it really has shaped you because it's defined the career that you've built today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if you wound back the clock knowing what you know, what would you do differently now that you're coaching other women and drawing on that experience? Would you have changed up anything?
Yeah, there are two things that I wish I knew then that I know now. First of all, you don't need to do it all on your own. Get some
Mm,
help. That's not a sign of weakness, that's a sign of strength. Asking for help and support from those around you to really be able to get to a point where you feel confident. And then also really doing that mindset work to learn how to back yourself and believe in yourself. Because
mm.
that's often the dissenting voice in the room. And there were many times where I was the only female in the room. And I thought, I must be wrong.
So when you say seek some support, if you were the only female in the room, where did you go? Where would you have gone?
Listen, I think there's a few ways to do that. I think when you're the only female in the room, it's having the courage to have a conversation with a male counterpart and say, listen, I don't know if you've noticed this is happening. I'd really
Mm,
love your support. But it's also looking externally and saying, I need to find a coach or I need to find somebody who I can work on with this
mm,
outside of the room so I can come in with that strength. Right. So I
yeah.
was saying, when I was that dissenting voice, if I believed in myself more, I would have realized that I was just the dissenting voice because I actually had a stronger, better perspective that we should have taken forward.
Yeah. And also what you're saying in that is it's even though it was a room full of males that weren't necessarily hearing you, the go-to could still have been a male who was more aware and more intuitive and could have mentored you through the scenario. It didn't have to be a female.
Absolutely. Well, if there aren't any available, then you need to turn to
Mm,
what you have. But another thing that I recommend very often to women is find a female counterpart or colleague in the organization and support each other and talk each other up. Because when you're having those conversations outside of the meeting room saying, hey, I noticed so and so is doing a really great job, she's got really great ideas, people start to hear and see that more and believe it more.
Yeah, I get it. Thanks, Julie. Still to come up, facing our fears. So, Julie, fear, an emotional response triggered by the perception of danger, threat, or harm, whether real or imagined. So let's get personal. Can you share a time with me when you felt fear or felt in danger?
Yeah, I would say almost every day of my career, I felt in fear.
Wow.
Yeah. I was constantly in fear that people wouldn't think I was smart. They wouldn't think I was doing the right thing. They would question my actions, which often happened. Um, that I would get fired, and this created a level of anxiety inside of me that actually pushed me forward. It pushed
How
me to
long did you I mean, if you timestamp that, how long did you go through that? You say every day. So I'm assuming
it,
this isn't ongoing.
Yeah, no, it's not ongoing. And I would say, while I'm saying every day, it wasn't like every day I woke up saying, I am fearful today. It
Mm,
was
mm.
on the whole in life, I was worried or concerned about these things. And it's not uncommon.
No, it's
Uh,
self-doubt, isn't it?
yeah, it's the self-doubt. Yeah. And it sneaks
Mm,
up and it's something that we need to work on. So, and this actually propelled me forward because I worked harder and I pushed through to make sure that I was doing a good job. But at a
mm.
certain point, it starts to hold you back
Yeah.
because you burn out. And psychologically, we make much better decisions and do much better work when we're able to let go of that fear. Because when we are in fear, our brain thinks we are fighting for our life. We're no
Mm,
longer fighting that animal out in the wild. We see all of our colleagues as that animal, and we react in that way. If we're able to calm the nervous system, if we're able to step out of that fear and use all of the resources we have to think through a problem and find a
mm.
solution without having to be in that fearful spot, we come up with much better solutions.
Yeah.
And, the way fear shows up, it's not just for women, it's for men as well. And it shows up as bad behavior in the workplace
Mm.
because people are fearful that they're not enough. They start exhibiting behaviors where they're trying to mark their territory or they're trying to
Or
withhold
deflect or
information. Exactly, exactly.
mm,
And if we
mm,
can get everyone within the company to get to a point where they're able to let that go, let that fear go, and come from that place of confidence and power and knowledge,
mm.
we get to a much better place.
So I know you're doing quite a bit of work at the moment on understanding fear and how it can be a blocker. And you just touched on it that it's not just women, it's men's. What's the difference between how fear is portrayed between men and women in the workplace?
On the whole, there's not a difference in how it manifests. There's a difference in how it's perceived,
Mm.
right? If a man is exhibiting some sort of fear, he's being vulnerable and real. If a woman is showing fear, she's not strong enough and not good enough.
Oh, I'm squirming.
I know. I know. We
Yeah.
need to change these perceptions. One real way that it does show up in a difference is when it comes to looking for jobs and looking for that promotion.
How so?
A woman will look at a job rec and say, I have 8 out of 10 things on there. I'm fearful that I don't have the experience I need. Where a man will look at that same rec and say, I have 2 out of 10. I'm going
No,
for
no problems. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it.
Yeah, that's I mean, we've seen that play out over and over again. And back to your earlier point about, working harder to overcompensate for perception.
Yep. And that leads to burnout, and that
Mm.
leads to additional stress and anxiety and the things and fear and things that we're wanting to get rid of. So we need to get to a place where we're all standing in our strength.
Okay. So if we look at that and say, men will step forward with a criteria of 2 out of 10. Women won't step forward until a criteria of 8 out of 10. What are some of the strategies women can use to overcome those fears and go, you know what? Two's good enough for me. How do we get there?
First of all, it's education, because quite frankly, it doesn't even cross a woman's mind that that's possible, right? So when I'm working with clients and having these conversations, it's helping them to understand where their strengths are and how they can actually take on this role and move up. It's also doing exercises on your own where you step into something and do something that you might be fearful of or resistant to do. Take one small action every day. If you
Can you
take
give me an example of that? I mean, because I'm suggesting you've applied that to your own self.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, for example, if I had been nervous to come on this podcast, which I'm not, I was just excited. But in the past, I probably would have been nervous years ago, right? So instead of saying, I'm not going to do it, and saying, you know what, I'm going to step forward and do it. In the workplace, if you're nervous about having a conversation with somebody because you're
Mm,
afraid of how they're going to react, have that conversation. If you're
mm,
worried about applying for that role, just apply and see what happens. So
mm,
when you're taking an action every day, and you can start with things in your personal life, it doesn't have to be at work.
mm,
It can start with just having a conversation with a stranger at a coffee shop if that's something that
mm,
you wouldn't normally do, right? So start with things where there's no real consequence. Start with things that are easy to do. And if you start taking one action every day, at the end of 30 days, you will have started to shift your mindset into the belief that you can do all of these things.
and also, I'm thinking on the run here, Julie, but some of the behaviors that you see from women being um, overly dominant in the workplace is potentially women overcompensating for their fears. How do we recognize that if we're reporting to somebody and we're finding their leadership style is combative or unapproachable? How do we recognize when that's just who they are, or how do we identify that in fact they're playing to their fears, and how do we find middle ground to meet them? Because it's easier to get into a conflict scenario
Yeah.
than recognize the weakness.
So first of all, I would start out by saying that you said this specifically about women, but there are men who lead in this way as well, right? You get a
Because of
lot
fear.
because of fear.
Mm,
They don't want to be found out that they don't know what they're doing. And very often, a man has even more fear. And I experienced this specifically in my career with a gentleman who was really pushing forward and really bullying in a way and making my role difficult. And when I sat back and looked at it in hindsight, I realized, okay, he had a stay-at-home wife. He'd been in this job for 20 plus years, and he had a big mortgage. He was scared that his job was going to become irrelevant. And so he
mm,
was pushing back on me because he was worried that I was going to step in and take away his role. So if
yeah.
you look at this, it's really understanding and stepping back and saying, I know this person's treating me badly. Let me think about what are they potentially afraid of?
Mm,
Where are they coming from? Putting yourself in their shoes so you can start to go, aha. And now having that hindsight, instead of pushing on this person and saying, why aren't you including in me in meetings? And why are you going around me? I would have stopped and when I first started, had a conversation with him about help me understand where you're at. How can I best help and support you? How can we best work together? And it's approaching things as a we. So you're taking
mm.
it away from
De-escalating.
exactly,
Mm,
exactly. And one of my favorite phrases that I teach everyone I work with is, can you help me understand?
Mm,
right? Because you don't want to put somebody on the defensive. Oh, I see your point of view, but can you help me understand how you got there?
mm,
That's wrong. I disagree.
yeah, get it. So your work that you're doing with fear, and is that intersecting with the work you're doing as a hypnotherapist?
I would say the work I'm doing with as a hypnotherapist had always dealt with fear, but I hadn't thought about it in those terms. So it's a complete intersection. The work that I'm starting to do is looking at how do we begin to talk about this and support people in the workplace through this fear? Because we can have the best culture possible, we can be doing all the right things. If we have individuals within the company who have this internal fear that they're not voicing and they're
Mm,
becoming bad actors because of it, it's going to cause a problem. So I'm starting to look at how do we get within the company and do this individual as well as the group work to
mm,
really help people be their best selves, because you get the best output and you have
yeah,
the best experience as well.
yeah, rewarding. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks, Julie. That's it it's a little bit like hindsight. If you knew it all before, we wouldn't have faced into these challenges. But it it's those rich lived experiences that are shaping what we're all turning to do now, particularly as more mature age women. So, power of women question that I often ask someone who's joining me on the podcast: what is a phrase that defines you?
No regrets. I like to live life with no regrets. I don't want to ever look back and say, I should have tried that. I should have done that.
Love it.
And if something doesn't go well, if I've learned from it, it was a good experience.
Brilliant. Thank you. And if somebody out there is feeling unseen or unheard or facing into fears that they can't tackle, what advice would you give them?
There's a few different exercises that you can do. One I've already talked about, which is take one small action every day, because then you're starting to program your mind. The second is to really start to shift your mindset by asking, is it true?
Mm,
True that I'm not good enough? And look for those proof points, because we've gotten this far in life, and the likelihood is we have all the proof points that we're actually really successful. But for every 10 wins we have, we think about and fret about that one mishap. And we need to
mm,
shift that thinking and continue to think about the positive. And then, as I said before, is get help, look outside of yourself. Whether it's hiring a coach to work with or going to your best friend and just saying, I need a pep talk. Can we just chat for a few minutes? And can you just remind me of how amazing I am?
yeah, we all need a go-to person who can do that for us. So how do we find your business, Julie?
You can find me at juliedemsey.com, or well, that's my email address. And
Hmm.
then my website is juliedemsey.com.
And spell Dempsey for those who might misspell it. It is
Yes. DEM as in Mary, SEY.
yep.
And contrary to popular opinion, there's no P in the middle of that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks so much, Julie. That's really, really helpful because I know whatever is holding us back and blockages, this starts to unpack some of that. So my takeaway is don't just suffer this in silence. Seek some help by way of a mentor, and don't be afraid to voice how you're feeling in the room, because it may be that those around you simply don't realize how they're being perceived themselves, and they too may be overcompensating for their own shortfalls. So it it's a bit of a vicious circle. So thank you. If you enjoyed this episode of Power of Women and have been watching other episodes, please be sure to follow and like us on your preferred podcast platform. And you can also follow us and like us on Instagram, Facebook, and on LinkedIn. You can also connect with me directly on the Power of Women website, which is powerofwomen.com.au. And on that, on the contact page, let me know if there is a topic or a guest that you'd like me to pursue and you'd like to hear from. Until next time.